I'm like, oh, sorry, my editor said I have to ask this. Like, yeah, sorry. I'm just trying to get, think of a good headline because my editor always wants one. So maybe could you give me a bit more detail about that? And I feel like I'm always like, instead of being brave on my own, I'm like, let me just pretend it's like my boss's problem and not mine.
Kia ora, I'm Gabi Lardies, staff writer at The Spinoff. Welcome to Behind the Story, where we go behind the scenes of a big article on the spin-off from the week. Today, I'm talking to fellow staff writer Shanti Mathias, who usually sits next to me in the office. Next week, she's abandoning me. Life is taking her to Christchurch, where she will keep writing for the spin-off, but as a contractor rather than a staff member. We're here to chat about a few of what seem like hundreds of stories that Shanti has written since she started at the spin-off in 2021. I wanted to ask about a few of her favourite things she's worked on while being here and what her plans are for the future. Here's Shanti Mathias on Behind the Story. Hi Shanti, welcome to the pod.
Good, Gabby, thanks for having me.
You're so welcome. I noticed earlier when I was scrolling through hundreds of your stories, and it took me all morning, that you have been at the spin-off for more than 3 years.
Yeah, it's been a while.
Wow. And in that time, you have, we write quite broadly at the spin-off, but within that, you have carved out a few kind of beats for yourself. There's science, the environment, transport, gambling. There's been quite a lot of poo stories, a touch of international relations, and, of course, some data journalism. This week, we had from you a story called Getting Rid of Predators is One Thing, Keeping Them Gone is Another. So it's about Predator-Free 2050. Which has been kind of going for 9 years. There's a lot to work with there. There's 9 years, the whole country, a patchwork of different organisations spread around everywhere. Lots of journalists would maybe look at that and go, oh my God, so complicated, too hard. Let me go over here and write something more kind of straight and narrow, simple. What pulled you to want to write that piece?
Yeah, I didn't really want to write about Predator-Free 2050 as a whole, even though that's somewhat what I ended up doing. And even though I did that, there's lots of things which I missed, but
of course.
Obviously. But yeah, I really wanted to write about this kind of weird, how do you think about this weird trade-off that as we make more and more of New Zealand predator-free, but there's still lots of rats and stoats and possums running around everywhere else, that the more land that you have that is predator-free, the more resources you have to invest in like stopping that land from getting the predators coming back again. And I was like, well, I'm probably not the first person who thought of this. So I found a couple of other people who know a lot more about, predator control than I do, kind of talking about like, how do you actually decide like how many resources do you put into future things that don't exist that you get, like genetic editing or like better working traps or new toxins or whatever. How much do you put into like protecting the areas where there's already some predator control or like even zero predators, like the predator-free island? And how much resources do you put into making new areas have very low numbers of invasive pests? Like it's quite a big trade-off. And so that was like the kind of key part of the story that I was interested in, but I ended up looking at a few other diversions along the way.
Yeah, and how would you describe the balance that we're approaching those problems with, like in terms of where we put the funding and keeping things predator-free or trying to expand those zones?
I think that there's kind of an idea of like stuff which is quite scalable. So something that was really interesting to me was hearing about the Zero Invasive Predators, which is a company that works very closely with DOC, has a big area in South Westland that they're basically using a different idea of like, if we have a whole lot of continuous area that we're keeping predator free and we just manage the borders, and then the center of that area will stay predator free. And so the more area that there is, the bigger the number of kind of resources you can just put into just doing the area instead of having what we have now, which is often like a little bit here and then we'll have a whole lot of area like farmland in between and there's lots of, rats or possums there and then we've got some over here and then that makes it, each of those things are more expensive than having a bigger area, which potentially than having a bigger area which is more kind of consistently looked after. So I think there's a lot of organisations and individuals who have really thought about this, and Predator Free New Zealand Limited and DOC have both put a lot of like resources into trying to increase trying to look after the areas that they already have. But there's also a lot of research going on into the new technologies, which might end up really increasing over the next kind of couple of decades and making it a lot easier to do predator control than it is now. Because as someone said, like, to me, that we're basically using the same traps we had 300 years ago. The technology hasn't advanced much, but there's a lot of things which are just, like DOC is just starting to try having more kind of electronic or not electronic gas resetting, self-resetting traps, and they're just starting to try to put these in and see if they can do them instead of having to have like biodiversity rangers just plodding through the kind of hills checking trap after trap manually, which is a lot of work and very expensive.
Yeah. Those gas power traps are so good because they reset themselves and have all this tech, but they're also so expensive. I saw in your article they're over $1,000 if I remember correctly.
Yeah, there's one which can identify the species it's trapping, which is really good so that we've got XYZ number of rats and this many possums. But and it has to be it would probably be cheaper if you're buying them in bulk, but if you're just buying a couple one-off, it's very expensive per unit, and they still need maintenance, and they're often being exposed to really harsh conditions, so they have to be really sturdy compared to tunnel traps, which can also be expensive, but you are just putting a few bits of wood in a sort of spring-loaded thing and some bait in the middle.
Yeah, but then they're sort of more expensive to maintain, so it's this another trade-off.
Yeah.
How do you feel about Predator Free 2050 now that you've wrote this article? Do you think it's a viable goal?
I think everyone who I talk to seems to think it's very ambitious and maybe unlikely that we'll get there, but like get there fully. But I guess the hope is that you learn a lot of things along the way. There's not because the funding is really patchy, like they had lots of funding from Jobs for Nature and the Provincial Growth Fund, which is now kind of basically run out. And so the government kind of needs to figure out what's the next pool of funding that we can draw on to keep predator control up. But then at the same time, they've also got these amazing things where there's heaps of volunteers, heaps of iwi, heaps of local councils who are just putting like huge amounts of both voluntary labour and like kind of their own resources in, which is, I think, what the government really hoped when they launched the goal, that people could sort of see that it's really valuable. So I think that's another thing of like how much is it, what is it fair to ask volunteers to do, or how much can you achieve with people putting things in themselves, and how much do you need how much do you need the government to do? And then there's some incentives for the private sector, like the farming and agriculture industry for, deer and, cattle farmers and stuff really don't want like TB from possums. So then they'll put a lot of money into trying to cull possums, and then Ministry for Primary Industries will as well. So one thing that I found out is that no one could give me a straight answer for exactly how much money has been spent on predator free, which is, no one quite knows, because no one's really been able to collect so many different organisations into one exact number. But it looks like it's about over $300 million, but no one's 100% sure.
Yeah, wasn't there an upper limit to that estimate as well that was in the billions?
I think no, it wasn't in the billions. Doc told me it was 180 million to 300 million plus. So it's somewhere in that ballpark. How much the government's put in is a little, and how much has been coming from, local councils and stuff. No one 100% knows.
Yeah, it's a pretty big ballpark.
Yeah.
The guess. So one of the reasons that we've had you on the pod today is because you're abandoning the Auckland office, which is equivalent also to abandoning me.
I'm so sorry, Gabi.
Such is life. So I wanted to look back a little bit at a few of your other stories too. The pod is not all that long, so we've just picked out a few from what is quite a big and actually iconic archive. The one I wanted to get into first was your piece last year called Sinking Lids and Rising Profits, The Problem with Pokies. And in this one, what really blew my mind was that while the number of pokey machines was going down, the profits made from them was going up and up and up, sort of in this inverse chart that you made. And I think this is a really good example of Shanti's data crunching because it's got that chart and also quite a few other ones. Can you tell me about your love of data and where it came from and why and how you use it to tell these stories?
So a few years ago, I got invited to go on in 2023, the Data Aotearoa workshop that was hosted by some of New Zealand's and actually international best data journalists. And I was very conflicted about going because my friend was getting married on the same weekend, but I was ultimately like, okay, it's worth going for this because it seemed like such a great opportunity. And so we spent 4 days just learning a whole lot of different things, which many of which probably just glanced off my smooth little brain, about kind of basically what to think about. Like, for example, with a graph, I think I would always think you might say, oh, look, there's a big line going up that says more pokey money, and that would be how you describe the graph. But instead to try to interpret it a bit for people to sort of say something like that was about a sinking lids policy, which there's a policy that there's going to be fewer gambling machines over time, gaming machines over time. And so I said, despite sinking lids policies that kind of local councils have done, kind of each individual machine can kind of still end up making more money. So it's not as simple of a policy solution, even though there are some advantages to having that policy. I think learning how to really clearly describe what's in the data, I think that felt like a really great tool that has really helped how I see the world, as well as just thinking about nice presentation things like, how do we make it clear to people when I'm writing a alt text so that someone who can't see the graph or interact with it so easily can still understand the meaning that's in it. And then you always find that you have to add in various caveats of like, oh, I made an assumption about this, or we didn't include this year of data because it was incomplete or something. So trying to think about at what point does the data become like so poor quality that it's not worth using. But you can also use data in lots of like fun and silly ways. Like I made a graph for Alex Casey, our colleague, about the Oscars last year of like the number with kind of showing the number of like people under the age of 15 and the number of them who are New Zealanders kind of thing, like a big overlap. So there's lots of kind of being a little bit playful with it, starting from that workshop and then getting to experiment a bit from there on has, made me really like want to see stories in terms of numbers that can say something bigger, that it's not just the bare numbers, but something beyond that.
Yeah, you're really good at applying the data to a bigger picture or trend that's happening, and one that isn't so broad as to just say like, oh, gambling profits are going up, this is bad. It's much more complicated and like specific than that. I was wondering, also for that particular story, did you get your hands on the data and look at it before you interviewed the policy experts that you had?
Yeah, I interviewed a local councillor who'd been involved in setting up the Porirua's sinking lid policy, but I had been looking through the data sets, which there's so much information that the government releases that I think is freely accessible to the public, but people just don't have the time to go through. So I'd been looking at that for several days, and then got to ask him some specific questions about it and what do you think has worked. And then he had, an example of, I don't know, like a club that he was part of that had made the difficult decision to, even though it was a good thing to have for their personal revenue, to kind of no longer have a pokey machine. And that was kind of quite good of having that mix of personal anecdote and someone who was actually involved in decision making. And I think sometimes when you don't have that much time or it's hard to find the right person to talk to, it's nice to have, you don't need to do as much reporting of interviewing people because sometimes the data can kind of tell a story on its own.
Yeah. But you are one of those journalists that is very good at talking to people and finding the right people. Like, for example, the next story I wanted to bring up was the one about stripy polyprops, which was, it's one of my favorites of yours.
One of my favorites too.
For those that haven't read it, it's all about how, when we used to go tramping in the 90s, or camping, we would wear these really garish, stripy polyprops. They were synthetic, bright colors. They would not fit on your Instagram feed. They would be like, ding. And they're iconic. But sadly, now you go to the shops and it's all kind of block colors, navy, brown, beige, very refined aesthetics. And you sort of wrote what was essentially a love letter to these garments that I'm sure so many people consider ugly. But you found all these trampers to kind of attest for how amazing these garments were. At the same time, I think it's a real Shanti story. It comes from the heart and from what you love, and it kind of fits into a category that some of your other stories in this category are, hear me out, don't wrap your Christmas presents. I hate captures, the unnecessary ritual of having to prove you're a human being, and how to cope with not seeing the aurora this weekend when everyone else did. But it's got a key difference to those ones. Those other three are 100% Shanti words, where there is this Pro one. You interviewed lots of people. What was your thinking behind getting more voices in that piece?
To be honest, some of the ones that you've just mentioned, like, I actually wanted to interview someone basically who had the same opinion that I did, but just use their words instead of mine. And then for various reasons that didn't work out. Like the capture one, I was like, I couldn't find anyone who complained about captures in the exact way that I wanted to complain about captures. So I was like, okay, never mind, I'll do it myself.
Yeah, I can't imagine you would have found someone to say, don't wrap your Christmas presents either.
I'm sure they're out there. I'm sure my community's out there. But yeah, I think the Polypro one, I really felt like it was a specific kind of cultural niche, and the spin-off really has a bit of lots of like New Zealand nostalgia, which I sometimes feel is a little bit like stultifying. It really locks us into one particular idea of people who are young in the 90s or early 2000s and had and I never did the things of kind of coming home for a particular after-school television because I grew up a lot of my time overseas, so I really felt like I kind of missed out on some of that spin-off nostalgia. Like, I don't know who Susie Cato is, for example. I mean, I do now because I've been told extensively by spin-off articles, but I didn't before. So I felt like, I was like, this is my bit of nostalgia content that I can do, and I'm sure there's lots of other people out there who are also nostalgic for it, and who could maybe describe the exact feeling that they had when they were first wearing their stripy poly prop themselves. So I think that was... and also because I, have done a fair bit of tramping in my time, I kind of knew which of a few strings to pull for people to ask. And yeah, it felt like you could do a little bit of kind of exploring the different outdoor retailers and just being like, there's nothing out there. Yeah, so that was really fun, of finding people also who had been, adopting it, long before I was born, who were also very into the stripes. So it was nice to get a bit of a different age range. But I did choose to partially because my mother had some very cute photos of me as a small child wearing my stripy polypro. I was like, oh, maybe I'll put that in the story as well, just because I'm like, I actually am personally invested in this too.
We've had a few gifts from your parents' photo archive.
Yeah.
Also the one of you jumping across that valley in the
mountains.
For my
homeschooling essay
experience.
Yeah.
What a joy to see baby Shanti. And in your 3 and a bit years here, you have eaten insects, ranked nuts, interviewed someone while cycling, found yourself in sewage pipes, and also at an exclusive and painful NFT party. that was part of the IRL project, which you initially came on board to be part of, quite specifically. A project kind of all about the internet and the online world, what's going on online. And this particular story of your experience at this horrible party became a cult classic very quickly. Can you tell me about what it was like and if you have any regrets doing these kinds of stories where you put yourself in questionable situations?
Yeah, I think that was sort of within a month or something of moving to Auckland, and I was writing for the IRL project, which was all about kind of the internet culture, and everyone was talking about NFTs and this sort of, there was sort of, the rumours were travelling mostly via sort of spin-off's number one hype man, Duncan Grieve, who was like, you got to do something about NFTs, and he had heard about this party, and he kind of finagled me an invitation, and then I just sort of showed up, and I told everyone I talked to, I told them that I was a journalist, and I actually was feeling initially very anxious, and then I was like, remembered that there was one inner part of myself that was like, this is a little bit silly. And so I just sort of, that kind of observed, and while I was trying to like engage somewhat authentically with the people, because it's not like, they're still human beings. I wasn't trying to make fun of them, but I was like, because I didn't want to be kind of recording the whole thing because that sort of scares people off. So I told people I was doing this, but I was like typing away on my phone while chatting to them, and there were just amazing things coming out of people's mouth. And there was a lot of people there who were very excited to talk to a journalist, and sort of told me, one person told me that, he was going to become rich from NFTs and make a sort of protein shake powder that could solve hunger for children. Which just, I was like, wow, the big ideas keep flowing. And I think trying to kind of, this sort of idea that there was a bit of a contrast between it seeming really exclusive, and I genuinely was, I don't know, I was wearing some like ratty skirt and like sort of a top that I had sewn myself, and there were all these people like genuinely quite nice, like probably designer clothing, quite wealthy, or at least wealthy enough to spend some of their money on NFTs, and kind of being surrounded by this aura of exclusivity and feeling really out of place, but then being like, okay, maybe I can use the out of place to try to observe people. And I really didn't want to be unkind, and I kind of still felt like it's really hard to do that when people make it really easy to make it look like you're being making fun of them, even though I genuinely was accurately reporting my experience at that party. But yeah, I feel really grateful that at the spin-off I've had all these opportunities to put myself in very uncomfortable situations. Press conferences I also hate. I'm always like, oh, I have to ask a question. And just like quite a few moments I can remember where I've had to be like, take a deep breath and be like, okay, I just have to walk through the door. Like, it's really nice when it's your job, so you don't actually have a choice about doing it or not. You're like, I guess I better do this now that I've signed up.
Yeah, and it's a bit of a protection as well to be able to say, oh, I'm here because I'm writing about it. So it's this little removal of yourself, so you don't have to be quite so vulnerable.
Yeah, that does kind of keep you safe. I will say, like, much love to my editors, Maddie Holden and Mad Chapman and Alice Neville, because there are definitely times when people have been like not wanting me to ask a particular question, or like disagreed with me about how I've like written a headline, and like, sometimes, normally it's because it is what the editors have said, but sometimes not. I'm like, oh, sorry, my editor said I have to ask this. Like, sorry. I'm just trying to get, think of a good headline because my editor always wants one. So maybe could you give me a bit more detail about that? And I feel like I'm always like, instead of being brave on my own, I'm like, let me just pretend it's like my boss's problem and not mine.
What an excellent strategy.
Yeah. So that's a free one for all journalists out there.
So now that you're moving to Christchurch, I was wondering if you have any business that you feel is unfinished here.
So I'm really sad that I never managed to write anything about the City Rail link. I'm really excited about the City Rail link. I think it's going to be really fun. I actually tried to write something about it last week, but it didn't work out because they wanted to. They were like, "Oh, we'll do a proper media trip," and I was like, "But I'm not going to be here. What about me?" I really want to go, and I should have really organised myself to go walk through the tunnel, to go down, to kind of go down the steps, to sort of talk to one of the artists making the big murals that they're going to have. Anyway, that feels like one thing that I wish that I had gotten to write about while I was still in Auckland. Yeah, and I guess there's just some like follow-up stories. Like I've really enjoyed writing about like swimming and water pollution, and I'm really excited for Auckland to have its new central interceptor pipe, which is going to make swimming a lot cleaner. And I would love to do like in 2 years' time, like a follow-up piece of how central interceptor has made a difference. But I'm moving to Christchurch, but I might come back to Auckland, but who knows if I will or not. But yeah, I would hopefully someone else can take up that mantle and be writing about the poo pipes and the train pipes and all of the other pipes that are out there, the infrastructure.
All the coolest underground stuff.
Yeah, just any excuse. I think as a journalist, when you're sitting at your desk all day, it's always really exciting when you get to put on high vis and a hard hat and you're like, wow, this is what it's like to have a job in the real world. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, life beyond the office is quite novel sometimes. And I maybe haven't made it clear to listeners yet, but Shanti will still be writing for the spinoff.co.nz, luckily for us. It will be a little bit less frequent, but still 2 times a week or so.
That,
You'll see her on site. But that does give you a little bit of time to do some other things. So I was wondering, what are you looking to do in that bit of extra time?
Well, first of all, also what I'm going to be writing about is Christchurch-based stories, and I'm really excited to write about cycling in Christchurch and interesting events that are happening and the Christchurch City Council and Environment Canterbury and anything else in the wider South Island that you think should be covered. So, please, if you're a listener from Christchurch, please hit me up. I would love to hear your ideas. Secondly, I'm not completely sure. I feel like I'm not completely sure what I'm going to do with the rest of that time. Hopefully, I'm looking into a few different things to write more about science. I'd really like to write more about the ocean and more about like kind of light pollution. I'm really interested in this idea of like things which you can make a small difference to, which aren't that politicized, that like a little policy change, like having more efficient lighting saves heaps of energy. No one usually gets that mad about it, and can also make, a big difference to sort of people's lives and ability to like navigate the city when you have good lighting. And a lot of cities haven't thought about that very much. Not that I'm saying Christchurch has a problem with that necessarily, but I think things like that I would be excited to write about more, sort of little policy things. And I'm also really interested in, you mentioned that I've written a bit about kind of international, like foreign affairs. I'm really interested in particularly in like international aid and migration. So would love to write more about that and New Zealand's relationship with the Pacific and China and Australia. I'm really fascinated by.
Cool. Wow. Can't wait to read. Thank you so much, Shanti, for joining us today and for 3 and a bit wonderful years at the Auckland office. We'll miss you so much, but I'm happy that we'll still get to read your birds.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gabi. And I will definitely miss you and all the rest of the Spin-Off Auckland crew.
That was the one and only Shanti Mathias on Behind the Story. Mad will be back next week with another spin-off writer and another spin-off yarn. Thanks for listening.